The blizzard hit without mercy, slamming ice against the windows of the small cabin like nature's fist. Evelyn Crawford stood frozen at her kitchen sink, watching headlights pierce through the white chaos. One motorcycle, then 5, then 10, 25 leather-clad strangers rolled into her driveway, their engines growling through the howling wind, surrounding her home like a dark promise she never asked for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Evelyn Crawford was 74 years old, a widow living in a weathered cabin on the outskirts of Timber Falls, Idaho. The cabin sat nestled against the mountains, miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by pine trees that creaked and swayed in the brutal winter winds. She had lived here for 43 years, ever since Frank brought her as a young bride, promising her a life of peace and simplicity. He had kept that promise until the day his heart gave out, 5 years ago, leaving her alone with memories and a mortgage she could barely afford. Evelyn's days followed a gentle rhythm. She woke before dawn, fed the 3 chickens that stubbornly survived each winter, and spent her mornings knitting scarves she sold at the town market. Her afternoons were filled with small tasks, mending clothes, reading worn paperbacks, writing in a journal Frank had given her decades ago. The entries were shorter now, quieter, like her life had become. Money was always tight. Frank's pension had dried up years before he passed, and Social Security barely covered her groceries. The mortgage, a burden they had hoped to pay off before retirement, loomed over her like a shadow. Every month, Evelyn scraped together what she could, but she was falling behind. 3 months overdue, then 4. The bank had sent letters, polite at first, then firmer. She kept them in a drawer, unopened, as if ignoring them might make the problem disappear. She told no one, not the neighbors, not the few friends she had left in town. Pride, perhaps, or shame, maybe both. Winter in Idaho was unforgiving. The roads became impassable for days after a heavy snow, cutting her off from the town below. Evelyn had learned to prepare. Canned goods lined her pantry shelves, firewood stacked high against the cabin's north wall, blankets piled thick on her bed. She didn't mind the isolation. In fact, she preferred it. The silence reminded her of Frank, of the nights they'd sit by the fire, saying nothing, needing nothing but each other's presence. But tonight, the silence shattered. Evelyn had just finished her evening soup, a thin broth made from yesterday's chicken bones, and the last of her carrots, when she heard it. A distant rumble, low and menacing, growing louder with each passing second. At first, she thought it was thunder, but thunder didn't shake the floorboards beneath her feet. She moved to the window, pulling back the faded curtain. Her breath caught headlights, dozens of them cutting through the swirling snow like knives. Motorcycles, one after another, roaring up her long gravel driveway. She counted them, her heart pounding harder with each number. 25 motorcycles, their riders clad in black leather, their faces hidden behind scarves and helmets. Fear gripped her chest. She had heard stories about bikers, whispered tales in town about the Hells Angels who occasionally passed through Idaho on their way west. Stories of bar fights, of violence, of men who lived outside the law. She had never seen them herself, never had reason to. Until now, the engines cut off one by one, leaving only the howl of the wind. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Evelyn's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the sink. What did they want? Why were they here? She watched as the riders dismounted, their boots crunching against the snow-covered gravel. They were massive, towering figures in the dim light of her porch lamp. Their leather jackets bore patches she couldn't quite make out from this distance, but she didn't need to. She knew who they were. Her mind raced. Should she lock the door? Hide in the bedroom? Call someone? But her phone line had been dead since the storm began, and the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. She was alone, completely alone. Then came the knock. 3 heavy, deliberate thuds against her wooden door, echoing through the small cabin like a drum. Evelyn froze. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She thought of Frank, of how he had always told her to face fear with a steady heart. Fear makes you small, Evie, he'd say. Stand tall, even when you're shaking. But she was shaking badly. Another knock, louder this time. Ma'am? A deep voice called through the door, muffled by the wind. We don't mean any harm. Roads are closed. We're freezing out here. Could we come in? The voice was rough, weathered, but there was something in it that surprised her. Desperation, not threat. Desperation. Evelyn stood motionless, her mind at war with itself. Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to pretend she wasn't home. But another part of her, a quieter, gentler part, remembered a night 40 years ago when she and Frank had been stranded on a mountain road during a blizzard. A stranger had opened their door, given them warmth and food, and sent them on their way at dawn. That stranger had saved their lives. She closed her eyes, drew a deep breath, and made her decision. Her hand reached for the doorknob. It was cold beneath her palm, the metal biting into her skin. She turned it slowly, the latch clicking open. The door swung inward, and a gust of frigid wind rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of gasoline and leather. 25 men stood on her porch and in her yard, their faces obscured by the storm, their presence overwhelming. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. They simply stared at each other, a frail, elderly woman in a faded nightgown and robe, and a crew of hardened bikers who looked like they'd been carved from stone. The man at the front stepped forward. He pulled down his scarf, revealing a face lined with age and scars, a thick grey beard dusted with snow. His eyes, though, were what caught her. They weren't cruel. They were tired, human. Name's Hank, he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. We got caught in the storm. Didn't think it'd hit this hard. We just need somewhere warm for the night, ma'am. We won't cause trouble. I swear it. Evelyn studied him, then looked past him at the others. They stood quietly, their heads bowed slightly against the wind, waiting. Not demanding, waiting. She thought of the stories. She thought of the fear that had gripped her just moments ago. But she also thought of Frank, of kindness, of the stranger who had saved them all those years ago. You'll freeze to death out there, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. Come in, all of you. One by one they entered, stomping snow from their boots, their massive frames filling her tiny cabin. The warmth of the fire met the cold air, steam rising from their damp leather. Evelyn closed the door behind them, sealing out the storm and sealing herself inside with 25 strangers. The cabin had never felt so small. 25 men filled every corner, their leather jackets dripping melted snow onto her worn wooden floors. The air grew thick with the scent of cold leather, gasoline, and wet wool. Evelyn stood by the door, her back pressed against it, watching as these massive strangers crowded into her living room. They moved carefully, almost hesitantly, as if aware of how out of place they were. One man ducked his head to avoid hitting the low ceiling beam. Another accidentally knocked over a small plant on the windowsill and quickly reached to steady it. Muttering an apology under his breath, Hank stood in the center, his grey beard still glistening with melting snow. He raised his hand, and immediately the low murmurs stopped. The men fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Listen up, Hank said, his voice firm but respectful. This woman just opened her door to us when she had every reason not to. We're guests here. We act like it. No touching anything. No wandering. You sit where she tells you to sit, and you thank her for every damn thing she gives you. Understood? A chorus of low, yes sir responses filled the room. Evelyn blinked, surprised. She had expected chaos, maybe even aggression. But this? This was discipline, order, respect. Hank turned to her, his weathered face softening. Ma'am, we're grateful, truly. We'll stay out of your way as much as we can. Just point us where you need us. Evelyn swallowed hard, her fear beginning to ease, replaced by something unexpected. Pity. These men looked exhausted. Their faces were red and chapped from the cold, their hands trembling as they removed their gloves. One younger man in the back was shivering violently, his lips tinged blue. You're freezing, she said quietly, more to herself than to them. Then louder, sit, all of you. Near the fire if you can fit. They moved slowly, arranging themselves on the floor, on her old couch against the walls. The small fireplace crackled in the corner, its warmth barely enough for one person, let alone 25. But they huddled close, grateful for even the smallest relief from the bitter cold outside. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway, wringing her hands. She had so little, a half loaf of bread, some beans, a few cans of soup. How could she possibly feed 25 men? But then she remembered Frank's words, spoken long ago during another hard winter. A meal shared is never too small. It's the sharing that fills the belly, not the portion. She moved into the kitchen, her slippered feet padding softly across the floor. She pulled out everything she had: 3 cans of bean soup, a bag of rice, half a package of pasta, 2 onions, and a small chunk of salt pork she'd been saving. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As she worked, chopping the onions with her worn knife, she became aware of eyes watching her. She glanced up. Several of the men were staring, not with malice, but with something like awe, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. One of them, a younger man with a scar running down his left cheek, leaned toward Hank and whispered, "She's actually cooking for us?" Hank nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, Cole, she is." Cole's eyes glistened. He looked away quickly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. Evelyn stirred the pot on the stove, stretching the ingredients as far as they could go. The soup was thin, more broth than substance, but it was hot. And warmth, she knew, was what they needed most. As she worked, Hank approached the kitchen doorway. He didn't enter, just stood at the threshold, his large frame filling the space. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low, "I need you to know something. We're not what people think we are." Evelyn glanced at him but said nothing. Hank continued, choosing his words carefully. "We've made mistakes, all of us. We've lived hard lives, but we're not monsters, most of us. We're just trying to get by, trying to find some kind of family when the world didn't give us one." Evelyn set down her spoon and turned to face him fully. "Why are you telling me this?" Hank's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw the weight he carried. "Because you let us in, and I don't want you lying awake tonight thinking you made a mistake." A long silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. Inside, the fire crackled softly. "I don't think I made a mistake," Evelyn said quietly. "Not yet, anyway." Hank's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Fair enough." 20 minutes later, Evelyn carried the large pot into the living room and set it on the coffee table. She had only 8 bowls, so the men would have to share, taking turns. She handed out the bowls along with mismatched spoons she'd collected over the years. "It's not much," she said, almost apologetically. "But it's hot." The first man to receive a bowl stared down at it as if it were a treasure. He lifted the spoon slowly, tasted the broth, and closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. One by one the men ate, passing the bowls around in a quiet, orderly rotation. No one complained. No one asked for more. They simply ate, grateful for every spoonful. Evelyn sat in her armchair watching them. The fear that had gripped her earlier had faded almost entirely. In its place was something strange and unfamiliar, a sense of purpose. She hadn't cooked for anyone but herself in 5 years. She had forgotten what it felt like to be needed. Cole, the young man with the scar, finished his portion and handed the bowl to the man beside him. Then he looked at Evelyn, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "My grandma used to make soup like this," he said. "Haven't had anything like it in, I don't know, 10 years? Maybe more." Evelyn's chest tightened. "What happened to her?" Cole's jaw clenched. "She passed. Cancer. I was 17. After that, things kind of fell apart." He paused, then added quietly, "I never got to tell her thank you. For all the times she fed me. For all the times she didn't give up on me." Evelyn's eyes softened. She reached over and gently patted his hand. "She knew, sweetheart. Grandmothers always know." Cole's throat bobbed. He nodded quickly and looked away, blinking hard. The room fell into a comfortable silence. The storm raged outside, but inside, surrounded by strangers who no longer felt quite so strange, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt less alone. Hank stood, stretching his stiff legs. He looked around at his crew, then back at Evelyn. "Ma'am, we'll clean up. You've done more than enough." Evelyn started to protest, but Hank raised a hand. "Please let us do this." And so they did. The men moved with surprising care, washing the bowls in her small sink, wiping down the table, even sweeping the floor. They worked in silence, respectful and efficient, as if they understood the sacredness of the space they occupied. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Evelyn excused herself to her bedroom. She closed the door softly and sat on the edge of her bed, her heart still racing. She had let 25 Hell's Angels into her home, and against all odds she was still safe, still unharmed, still strangely at peace. Outside her door, she could hear the low murmur of voices, the occasional soft laugh. These men, hardened by the world, had found refuge in her tiny cabin. And perhaps, she thought, she had found something too. A reminder that kindness, even in the face of fear, was never wasted. Evelyn woke before dawn, as she always did. For a moment, she forgot about the night before. Then she heard it. The low rumble of snoring, the creak of floorboards, the shuffle of boots. Her eyes snapped open. 25 men were sleeping in her living room. She sat up slowly, her joints protesting, and wrapped her robe tightly around herself. Through the thin walls, she could hear the wind still howling, though not as fiercely as before. The storm was weakening, but it wasn't over yet. Evelyn padded softly to her bedroom door and opened it a crack. The sight before her was surreal. Men sprawled across her floor, some propped against walls, others curled up on the couch. Their leather jackets served as blankets, their boots still on, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. Hank sat upright in the corner, wide awake, his back against the wall. His eyes met hers immediately. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. He hadn't slept. He'd been keeping watch. Evelyn stepped into the hallway, and Hank rose quietly, careful not to wake the others. He moved toward her with surprising grace for a man his size. "Morning, ma'am," he whispered. "Storm's still going, but it's dying down. We'll be out of your hair soon as it clears." Evelyn glanced at the windows. Snow still fell, but lighter now, the world outside painted in shades of grey and white. "You can't leave yet," she said. "Not in this. You'll freeze before you make it a mile." Hank's expression softened. "We've imposed enough." "Nonsense," Evelyn said more firmly than she intended. "I'll make coffee. And breakfast if I can manage it." Before Hank could protest, she shuffled into the kitchen. She had 4 eggs left, half a loaf of bread and some butter. It wasn't much, but she could make it work. She always did. As she moved about the kitchen, more of the men began to stir. They woke quietly, respectfully, stretching sore muscles and rubbing their faces. Cole was among the first to rise, his scar more prominent in the morning light. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression sheepish. "Ma'am, can I help?" Evelyn turned, surprised. "You cook?" Cole shrugged. "My grandma taught me a few things. Before everything." Evelyn handed him a knife and pointed to the bread. "Toast. As many slices as you can manage." Cole set to work, slicing the bread with careful precision. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, the smell of butter and eggs soon filling the small cabin. One by one, the other men gathered, drawn by the scent of food. They ate in shifts again, sharing plates and mugs, no one complaining about the meager portions. Evelyn watched them, noting how they deferred to one another, how the older men made sure the younger ones ate first. "You're like a family," she observed aloud, not meaning to say it. Hank, standing near the fireplace with his coffee, nodded. "We are. Most of us didn't have much growing up. No fathers, mothers who worked 3 jobs. Brothers in jail or worse, the club, it gave us something to belong to." Another man, broad-shouldered with graying temples, spoke up. His name was Russ. "People see the patches and think we're criminals. Some of us have records, sure. But most of us, we're just trying to survive, trying to take care of each other." Evelyn poured herself a cup of coffee and sat in her armchair. "Why the motorcycles?" Hank smiled faintly. "Freedom, I guess. Out on the road, nothing chasing you but the wind. No one telling you who to be. It's the only place some of us feel alive." Cole, sitting cross-legged on the floor, added quietly, "And it's loud. The engine drowns out everything else. All the bad memories, all the mistakes." He paused. For a little while at least, the room fell silent. Evelyn sipped her coffee, letting their words settle. She had judged them before they even knocked on her door. But now, listening to them, she realized how wrong she'd been. "What about you, Mom?" Russ asked gently. "You live out here all alone?" Evelyn nodded. "My husband passed 5 years ago. We never had children, just each other." Her voice wavered slightly. "It's been quiet since." "Lonely?" Cole asked. Evelyn met his eyes. "Sometimes. But I manage." Hank set his mug down and crouched beside her chair, his voice low. "You've got this whole place to yourself. Must be hard keeping it up." Evelyn's gaze drifted to the window. "It is. Things break down. The roof leaks when the snow melts. The porch is rotting. I do what I can, but—" She trailed off. Unwilling to say more, Hank exchanged a glance with Russ. Something unspoken passed between them. "Mom," Hank said carefully, "we've got time before the road's clear. If there's anything that needs fixing, we'd be happy to help." "It's the least we can do." Evelyn's eyes widened. "Oh, no. I couldn't ask." "You're not asking," Russ interrupted gently. "We're offering." Before she could protest further, several of the men were already on their feet, inspecting the cabin. One noticed the loose door hinge. Another spotted the crack in the window frame. Cole ran his hand along the cold draft seeping through the doorway. "Got tools, ma'am?" Hank asked. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "In the shed out back. Frank's old toolbox." Within minutes the men were at work. Some ventured into the storm to retrieve the tools, returning with Frank's rusted but functional toolbox. Others began reinforcing the door frame, tightening hinges, sealing drafts with strips of cloth. Evelyn stood in the center of her living room, overwhelmed. These men, strangers just hours ago, were fixing her home. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. Cole knelt by the fireplace, examining the loose stones. "This needs mortar," he said. "But I can stabilize it for now." Russ climbed onto a chair, inspecting the ceiling. "You've got a leak starting up here. If we don't patch it now, come spring, you'll have real problems." They worked for hours, their movements efficient and purposeful. Evelyn tried to help, but they gently waved her off. "You've done enough, ma'am," Hank said. "Let us do this." So she sat, watching them transform her worn cabin into something a little more solid, a little more safe. As the afternoon light began to fade, the men gathered around the fire again. The storm had finally stopped. Outside, the world was blanketed in fresh snow. Pristine and silent, Hank stood, brushing sawdust from his jeans. "Roads should be clear by morning. We'll head out then." Evelyn nodded, though a small part of her felt an unexpected pang of sadness. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." Hank met her eyes. "No, ma'am. Thank you. You gave us more than shelter. You gave us respect." "That's rare." Cole approached, his hands shoved in his pockets. "If you ever need anything, ma'am, you call us. Hank will give you his number before we go." Evelyn smiled, her eyes misty. "I'll be fine." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. That night, as the men settled in for one last sleep, Evelyn lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the mortgage, about the letters in the drawer, about the weight she carried alone. She didn't know it yet, but the men in her living room were thinking about her too, and they were already making plans. Morning arrived with unexpected brightness. Sunlight poured through the windows, reflecting off the snow-covered landscape with blinding intensity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, silent, crystalline, beautiful. Evelyn rose early, as always, and made her way to the kitchen. The men were already stirring, packing their few belongings, preparing to leave. The atmosphere had shifted. There was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken reluctance to say goodbye. She made one final pot of coffee, stretching the last of her grounds as far as they would go. The men gathered around, accepting their cups with quiet gratitude. "Roads should be clear enough now," Hank said, standing by the window. "We'll get out of your way." Evelyn nodded, though her heart felt strangely heavy. "Be safe out there." As the men began to file toward the door, Cole lingered behind. He glanced around the cabin, his eyes landing on details Evelyn had stopped noticing years ago. The water-stained ceiling, the cracked linoleum in the kitchen, The ancient refrigerator that hummed and rattled like it might die any moment. His gaze fell on something half-hidden on the small desk in the corner. A stack of envelopes. The return address was visible. First National Bank of Idaho. The word urgent stamped in red across the top envelope. Cole's stomach tightened. He glanced at Evelyn, who was saying goodbye to one of the other riders near the door. She hadn't noticed him looking. He shouldn't have looked. He knew that. But something about those letters, about the way they were tucked away, as if hidden from the world, made his chest ache. Cole turned away quickly, joining the others as they filed outside. But the image of those envelopes stayed with him, burning in his mind. The men mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life one by one. Evelyn stood on her porch, her thin robe wrapped tightly against the cold, watching them prepare to leave. Hank approached her one last time, pulling a small piece of paper from his jacket. "My number," he said, pressing it into her palm. "If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call." Evelyn's fingers closed around the paper. "I will." "Thank you, Hank." He studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing it. Then he nodded, turned, and walked to his bike. One by one, the motorcycles rolled down the driveway, their tracks cutting dark lines through the pristine snow. Evelyn watched until the last one disappeared around the bend, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. Then she was alone again. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through her slippers, before finally turning and going back inside. The cabin felt emptier now, colder, as if something vital had left with those men. Evelyn moved through her morning routine mechanically. She fed the chickens, washed the few dishes left behind, straightened the blankets. But her mind kept drifting back to those 24 hours, to the way they had looked at her, to the way they had worked on her home without being asked, to the way Cole's eyes had softened when he talked about his grandmother. She thought she'd never see them again. But she was wrong. Meanwhile, 5 miles down the mountain road, the convoy of motorcycles pulled off into a clearing. Hank raised his hand, signaling everyone to stop. Engines died one by one until only the wind remained. The men dismounted, gathering in a loose circle. Cole stood at the edge, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Hank looked around at his brothers. "Anyone else see what I saw?" Russ nodded grimly. "The place is falling apart, and she's trying to hold it together alone." Another rider, a man named Vic with tattooed knuckles, spoke up. "Did you see her cupboards?" "Practically empty. She gave us everything she had." Cole finally spoke, his voice low. "There were letters on her desk. From a bank. Marked urgent." He paused, guilt flashing across his face. "I wasn't snooping. I saw them." The group fell silent. Hank's jaw tightened. He knew what those letters meant. He'd seen them before, on his own mother's kitchen table years ago, right before they lost the house. "We need to know how bad it is," Hank said quietly. Russ pulled out his phone. "I've got a buddy who works at the county records office. If there's a lien or foreclosure notice, it'll be public record." Hank nodded. "Do it quietly." The men stood in the cold, their breath visible in the morning air. They had ridden into that storm expecting nothing more than a place to wait it out. Instead, they had found something rare, someone who saw them as human beings, someone who treated them with dignity when the rest of the world wouldn't. "She fed us," Cole said, his voice cracking slightly. "She didn't have enough for herself and she fed us." Vic kicked at the snow. "My old lady used to do the same thing. Give away the last bit of food to make sure we kids ate. She never complained. Not once." His voice hardened. "I'm not letting another woman like that go down because the world doesn't care." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Hank pulled out his phone and made a call. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Paulie, it's Hank. I need you to check something for me. County records. Timber Falls, Idaho. Property owner, Evelyn Crawford." There was a pause, the sound of typing. Then Paulie's voice came back, quieter now. "Hang on." The men waited. The wind howled softly through the trees. Finally, Paulie spoke again. "Yeah, I've got it. Property at 4782 Pine Ridge Road. There's a mortgage." "Jesus, Hank, she's 4 months behind." Bank filed a notice of default 3 weeks ago. If she doesn't come up with the full amount by the end of the month, they're foreclosing." Hank's grip tightened on the phone. "How much does she owe?" "Total outstanding balance, 42,000. The number hung in the air like a weight. Hank closed his eyes. "Thanks, Paulie." He ended the call and looked around at his brothers. 24 faces stared back at him, waiting. 42,000, Hank said quietly. "She's got 3 weeks, or she loses everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Russ let out a low whistle. "That's not pocket change." "No," Hank agreed. "But it's not impossible either." Cole stepped forward. "We do it. We take care of it." Vic nodded. "Damn right we do." Another rider, a younger man named Sam, spoke up. "How? We're not exactly rolling in cash." Hank's mind was already working. "We reach out to the other chapters. Put the word out. Everyone throws in what they can. We've got contacts in 6 states. If every member contributes even a little, we can make it happen." Russ grinned. "I know a guy who owns a bar in Boise. He'll run a fundraiser if I ask." Vic added, "And I've got connections with a few mechanics. We can raffle off some custom work." The ideas came faster now, building momentum. These men, who the world saw as outlaws, were planning something the world would never expect, an act of pure, unselfish generosity. Hank raised his hand, and the chatter stopped. "We've got 3 weeks. We don't tell her. We don't make a big show of it. We just do it quietly, the way she would." Cole's eyes glistened. "She won't even see it coming," Hank nodded. "That's the point." The men mounted their bikes again, but this time they rode with a purpose that went beyond the road. They were riding for Evelyn Crawford, for the woman who had opened her door when no one else would, and they would make sure she never lost her home. 3 days after the bikers left, Evelyn made her weekly trip into Timber Falls. The roads had been plowed, though walls of snow still lined the streets, creating narrow passages through town. She drove her old pickup truck slowly, the engines sputtering in protest with every turn. Timber Falls was small, 1 main street, a handful of shops, a diner and a church. Everyone knew everyone, which meant everyone knew everyone's business. Evelyn had lived here long enough to understand how quickly gossip spread, but she hadn't anticipated just how fast. She parked outside Thornton's general store, the same place she'd been shopping for 40 years. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and immediately she felt it. The shift in the air. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Eyes followed her as she made her way down the narrow aisles. Evelyn kept her chin up, selecting her items with deliberate calm. A bag of flour, some canned vegetables, a carton of eggs. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them in her basket, but she refused to show it. At the counter, Mr. Thornton rang up her items without his usual pleasantries. His mouth was pressed into a thin line, his eyes avoiding hers. "That'll be $18.40, he said flatly. Evelyn counted out the bills, her movements slow and careful. As she handed him the money, he finally looked at her, his expression hard. "Folks are talking, Evelyn," he said quietly, though not quietly enough. Several customers nearby leaned in, pretending not to listen. "They're saying you had Hell's Angels at your place during the storm." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I had 25 men who needed shelter. What was I supposed to do? Let them freeze?" Mr. Thornton shook his head. "You don't know what kind of people they are. Criminals, troublemakers. You're lucky they didn't rob you blind." "They fixed my porch," Evelyn said evenly. "They repaired my door. They were respectful and grateful. More so than some people I've known my whole life." The words hung in the air, pointed and sharp. Mr. Thornton's face reddened, but he said nothing. He handed her the change without another word. Evelyn gathered her bags and walked out, the bell chiming behind her. She could feel their eyes on her back, burning with judgment. Outside, she loaded the groceries into her truck, her hands shaking now from anger more than fear. She had done nothing wrong. She had shown kindness to strangers in need, and for that she was being treated like a criminal. As she climbed into the driver's seat, a voice called out, "Evelyn!" Wait! She turned to see Beatrice Walsh hurrying across the parking lot, her coat buttoned tight against the cold. Beatrice had been her neighbor for years, though they lived miles apart. They occasionally saw each other at church or in town. Beatrice reached the truck, slightly out of breath. Her expression was a mix of concern and disapproval. "Evelyn, is it true? Did you really let those bikers into your home?" Evelyn's shoulders sagged. "Yes, Beatrice, I did." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Evelyn, what were you thinking? Those men are dangerous. You could have been hurt, or worse." "They weren't dangerous," Evelyn said quietly. "They were cold and scared, just like anyone else would be in that storm." Beatrice shook her head, her voice rising slightly. "You don't know that. You hear stories about these people all the time. Violence, drugs. They live outside the law." Evelyn turned to face her fully, her voice steady but firm. "I know what I saw, Beatrice. I saw men who said please and thank you, who helped fix my home without being asked, who shared what little I had without complaint." She paused, her eyes hard. "Maybe the problem isn't them. Maybe it's us. Maybe we're too quick to judge people we don't understand." Beatrice took a step back, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "I'm just worried about you," she said finally, her voice softer now. "I appreciate that," Evelyn said. "But I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." She climbed into her truck and drove away, leaving Beatrice standing in the parking lot, watching her go. The gossip only grew worse. By Sunday it had reached the church. Evelyn sat in her usual pew near the back, her hands folded in her lap. She could feel the whispers, the sidelong glances. Women leaned toward each other, their voices low but audible. "Can you believe it? 25 of them! She's lucky to be alive." Evelyn stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. She tried to focus on the sermon, but the words blurred together, lost beneath the weight of judgment pressing down on her from all sides. After the service, as people filed out, Evelyn lingered, hoping to avoid the crowd. But as she stepped into the aisle, Sheriff Garrett appeared, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, his voice low. "Could I have a word?" Evelyn's heart sank, but she nodded. They stepped outside, away from the curious eyes of the congregation. Sheriff Garrett was a decent man, fair and even-tempered. He had known Frank, had respected him, but even his expression carried a heaviness now. "Evelyn," he began carefully, "I've been hearing things. About the bikers who stayed at your place." Evelyn crossed her arms. And people are worried. They think you might have put yourself in danger." "I didn't," Evelyn said firmly. "They were respectful. They left without incident. No one was harmed." Sheriff Garrett sighed. "I believe you, I do. But these men, their reputation follows them. The Hells Angels have a history, Evelyn. Not all of it good. So do a lot of people," Evelyn countered. "But we don't judge them all by their worst moments." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, his expression conflicted. "Just promise me you'll be careful. If they come back—" "They won't," Evelyn interrupted, though a small part of her hoped she was wrong. Sheriff Garrett nodded slowly. "All right, but if you need anything, you call me. Day or night," Evelyn softened slightly. "Thank you, Sheriff." "I will." As he walked away, Evelyn stood alone in the churchyard, the cold wind biting at her cheeks. She had never felt so isolated, so misunderstood. She drove home in silence, the weight of the town's judgment settling over her like a heavy blanket. When she reached her cabin, she sat in the truck for a long time, staring at the small structure Frank had built with his own hands. She thought of the men who had filled it just days ago, of Hank's quiet respect, of Cole's gratitude, of the way they had worked together, fixing what was broken. And she thought of the town, the people she had known for decades, who now looked at her with suspicion and fear. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt truly alone. Not because she had no one, but because the people around her refused to see what she saw, that kindness transcends labels, that humanity exists even in the most unexpected places. She climbed out of the truck and walked into her cabin, closing the door behind her. The silence was deafening, but far away, in garages and clubhouses across 6 states, phones were ringing. Messages were spreading. And a plan was taking shape, one that would silence the gossip and prove Evelyn Crawford right in ways no one could have imagined. The word spread like wildfire through the Brotherhood, from Idaho to Nevada, from Oregon to Montana, Washington and Wyoming. The message was the same. A woman had shown them kindness when the world showed them nothing but contempt. Now it was time to return the favor. Hank sat in the back room of a motorcycle shop in Boise, his phone pressed to his ear. Around him, maps were spread across a worn wooden table, alongside notebooks filled with numbers and names. "How much have we raised so far?" he asked. Russ, who had been coordinating the effort from his home in Spokane, answered immediately. 17,000 from the chapters, another 4 from the fundraiser at Mike's bar. The raffle for the custom paint job brought in 3 more. Hank did the math quickly. "That's 24,000. We need 18 more. We'll get it," Russ said confidently. Word still spreading. "We've got brothers from California reaching out now. They heard the story and want in." Hank leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his grey beard. In his 30 years with the club, he'd seen a lot of things. He'd seen loyalty tested and proven. He'd seen men risk everything for their brothers. But this was different. This wasn't about the club. This was about something bigger. Cole walked into the room, carrying a laptop. His expression was focused, determined. "I've been digging into the bank's foreclosure process," he said, setting the laptop on the table. "If we can get the money to them before the end of the month, the foreclosure stops. They'll reinstate the mortgage as current." Hank nodded. "And if we pay the whole thing off?" Cole's eyes lit up. "Then she owns it free and clear. No more payments. No more letters. She's safe." Vic appeared in the doorway, his phone in hand. "Just got off with Big Ray in Portland. His chapter's putting together a poker run this weekend. All proceeds go to Evelyn. He's estimating 5, maybe 6,000. Hank stood, his mind working through the numbers. They were close, so close. But close wasn't good enough. They needed $42,000, and they needed it in 2.5 weeks. "We need to think bigger," Hank said, pacing now. "What else can we do?" Russ's voice crackled through the phone. "There's a guy I know. Owns a chain of auto shops across Washington. Lost his mom a few years back. She was a lot like Evelyn. Tough, independent, lived alone. I told him the story. He wants to help. How much?" Hank asked. "He's thinking 10,000. Hank stopped pacing. 10,000? "Yeah, but he wants to meet you first. Make sure it's legit. Set it up," Hank said without hesitation. Over the next week, Hank traveled across 3 states, meeting with potential donors, speaking at club meetings, and sharing Evelyn's story. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The truth was powerful enough. An elderly woman, alone in the mountains, had opened her door to 25 strangers in the middle of a blizzard. She had fed them with what little she had. She had shown them dignity when the world offered them none. And now she was about to lose everything. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from unexpected places. A veteran in Oregon sent $500 with a note. "For the lady who reminded me there's still good in this world." A single mother in Montana contributed $20, writing, "It's all I have, but she deserves it." One chapter organized a bike wash. Another hosted a benefit concert. A bar in Nevada donated a percentage of their weekend sales. Even people outside the club started contributing after hearing the story through word of mouth. Cole tracked every dollar meticulously, updating a spreadsheet that grew longer each day. He called Hank every evening with updates. 31,000, he said on day 10, 36,000 on day 14, 40,000 on day 18. By day 20, they had raised $43,200. More than enough. Hank stood in the garage, staring at the final number on Cole's laptop screen. His eyes stung, though he'd never admit it. Around him, 24 men had gathered, all of them watching him with the same expression. Pride. "We did it," Vic said quietly. Hank nodded slowly. "Yeah, we did." Russ's voice came through the phone, which sat on speaker on the table. "So what now? How do we get it to her?" Hank thought for a moment. "We don't just hand her a check." She'd never accept it. Too proud, Cole spoke up. What if we pay the bank directly? Contact them, tell them it's an anonymous donation. Then we go to her and tell her it's been taken care of. Hank considered this.
She'll have questions.
She'll want to know who did it. Let her have questions, Cole said. As long as she keeps her home, Vic grinned. I like it. Simple, clean. She can't refuse something that's already done. Hank looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every man present. These were his brothers, men who had come from nothing, who had been judged and dismissed their entire lives. And now they were doing something beautiful, something the world would never expect from them. All right, Hank said. Cole, you handle the bank. Make the payment. Make sure it's anonymous. I don't want Evelyn's name tied to us in any official way. Let the bank tell her it's been paid. Cole nodded. I'll take care of it. And then, Hank continued, his voice growing stronger, we go see her, all of us. We ride to Timber Falls, and we make sure she knows she's not alone. Russ spoke through the phone. When? Hank glanced at the calendar on the wall. Next Saturday. 1 week from today. That gives Cole time to finalize everything with the bank. Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Over the next 6 days, Cole worked tirelessly. He contacted First National Bank of Idaho, explaining that he represented an anonymous group wishing to pay off Evelyn Crawford's mortgage in full. The bank was skeptical at first, but when the wire transfer cleared, $42,000, exact to the penny, they had no choice but to process it. On Friday afternoon, the bank sent Evelyn a certified letter. It arrived at her mailbox on Saturday morning, just as 25 motorcycles were rolling out of Boise, heading toward Timber Falls. Evelyn stood at her mailbox, the letter in her trembling hands. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the words once, then twice, then a third time, unable to believe what she was reading. Dear Mrs. Crawford, we are pleased to inform you that your mortgage has been paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. As of today, you own your property free and clear. No further payments are required. Her knees buckled. She grabbed the mailbox for support, tears streaming down her face. Frank, she whispered, looking up at the sky. Frank, what just happened? She didn't know, but she was about to find out. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, the letter from the bank spread before her. She'd read it a dozen times, and still the words didn't seem real. Paid in full. Anonymous benefactor. Free and clear. Her hands shook as she poured herself a cup of tea, the steam rising in delicate spirals. Who would do such a thing? She had no wealthy relatives, no secret admirers. No one who owed her anything. The mystery gnawed at her, but beneath the confusion was something else. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. The weight she had carried for months, the fear that had kept her awake at night, was gone. She wouldn't lose her home. She wouldn't lose Frank's memory, preserved in every board and nail of this cabin. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her weathered cheeks. Thank you, she whispered to whoever was listening. Whoever you are, thank you. Then she heard it. That familiar rumble. Distant at first, then growing louder, closer. Her eyes snapped open. She stood, moving to the window, her heart beginning to race. Motorcycles. Not just a few. Dozens of them, their headlights cutting through the bright afternoon sun as they wound up her driveway. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She stepped onto her porch, one hand gripping the railing for support. The bikes came to a stop, engines idling in perfect synchrony before shutting off one by one. The silence that followed was profound. 25 men dismounted, and at the front stood Hank, his grey beard catching the sunlight, his eyes locked on hers. Evelyn's voice came out as barely a whisper. What? What are you doing here? Hank walked forward slowly, respectfully, stopping at the base of her porch steps. Behind him, the others stood in formation, their expressions serious but warm. We came to make sure you got the letter, Hank said simply. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. It was you? Hank nodded. All of us, and a lot of others you've never met. Word spread about what you did for us, about who you are. People wanted to help, but how? How did you? Evelyn couldn't finish the sentence. Her mind was spinning. Cole stepped forward, his young face earnest. We reached out to every chapter, every brother, every friend who would listen. We told them about the woman who opened her door in the middle of a storm, who fed us when she barely had enough for herself, who saw us as human beings when the rest of the world saw criminals, Russ added, his voice rough with emotion. You gave us dignity, ma'am. That's not something people like us get very often. So we gave you something back. Security, peace of mind. Evelyn's legs felt weak. She sank onto the porch step, tears flowing freely now. I don't understand. I just gave you soup. I gave you shelter. That's what anyone would do. No, Hank said firmly, kneeling so he was at her eye level. That's what you would do. Most people, they would have left us in the cold. But you didn't, and that changed something in us. Vic spoke up from the back. My mother struggled like you did. Worked 3 jobs. Could barely keep the lights on. No one ever helped her. She died exhausted and broke. His voice cracked. I couldn't help her. But I could help you. One by one, the men shared their stories. Stories of mothers who sacrificed everything. Of grandmothers who raised them when no one else would. Of women who showed them kindness when the world showed them only judgment. You reminded us of them, Cole said softly. And we weren't going to let you lose your home the way some of us lost ours. Evelyn looked at their faces, these rough, scarred, tattooed men who society had written off. And she saw them clearly now, perhaps for the first time, not as outlaws or criminals, but as sons, as brothers, as human beings capable of extraordinary compassion. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, Hank replied. Just know that you're not alone anymore. You've got a family now. A big, loud, rough-around-the-edges family. But family nonetheless. Evelyn stood, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She descended the steps slowly and without warning, wrapped her arms around Hank. He stiffened for a moment. Surprised, then gently returned the embrace, one by one. The other men approached, each offering a hug, a handshake, or a quiet word of respect. Evelyn greeted them all, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. As the afternoon wore on, the men didn't leave. They stayed, sitting on her porch in her yard, sharing stories and laughter. Someone produced a guitar. Another brought out sandwiches they'd picked up in town. It became a celebration, not of the money, but of connection, of chosen family, of the proof that kindness, no matter how small, can create ripples that change lives. Down in Timber Falls, people noticed. 25 motorcycles parked at Evelyn Crawford's cabin was impossible to miss. But this time, the whispers were different. Mr. Thornton stood outside his store, watching the distant gathering through binoculars. His wife stood beside him. What do you think they're doing? She asked. He lowered the binoculars slowly. I think, he said quietly, we might have been wrong about them. Sheriff Garrett drove past Evelyn's property on his patrol, slowing as he saw the gathering. He expected trouble. Instead, he saw laughter, music, community. He shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips, and drove on. Even Beatrice Walsh, watching from her distant porch, felt something shift inside her. Maybe Evelyn had been right all along. Maybe the world needed more people willing to see past the surface, to recognize the humanity in everyone. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the bikers prepared to leave. Hank approached Evelyn one last time. If you ever need anything, he said, you call. Day or night, we'll be here. Evelyn smiled, her face glowing with gratitude. I know, and I'll never forget what you've done for me. Hank tipped his head respectfully. You did it first, ma'am. We just returned the favor. The engines roared to life, and one by one, the motorcycles rolled down the driveway. Evelyn stood on her porch, waving, until the last bike disappeared from view. The cabin was quiet again. But this time, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful, safe, full of promise. Evelyn walked inside, closing the door gently behind her. She moved to Frank's old chair and sat down, staring at the letter from the bank still on the table. Frank, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I think you'd be proud. I took a chance on kindness, and it came back to me 100-fold. Outside, the stars began to emerge, one by one, lighting up the Idaho sky. And somewhere out on the open road, 25 motorcycles carried men who had learned a truth they'd never forget. That the greatest strength isn't found in toughness or reputation. It's found in compassion, in seeing someone in need and choosing to act, in recognizing that we are all, at our core, just human beings trying to survive this world together. Evelyn Crawford had taught them that. And they had honored her in the only way they knew how, by making sure she would never face her struggles alone. Again, the story of the elderly woman who fed 25. Hell's Angels spread far beyond Timber Falls. It became legend, a reminder that kindness transcends labels, that generosity knows no boundaries, and that sometimes the people society fears the most are capable of the most beautiful acts of grace. And in a small cabin on a mountain in Idaho, an elderly widow slept peacefully for the first time in months, knowing that she was loved, protected, and forever part of a family she never expected to find. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.